Warning! Avoid the following places if you value your life.
The United States is full of creepy towns. You know, those places where the people are weird and the vibes just feel off. But while you might think the most chilling parts of America are all in the middle of nowhere, a lot are actually much closer than you probably thought. In fact, there's a ghost behind you! Oh, just kidding. Ghosts don't actually exist.
What? You dare question my existence? I am the ghost of YouTube! Now get on with the video. I am looking for a new city with a great ghost community.
Okay. Dang, maybe they are real. But reported haunted happenings aren't the only reason you should steer clear of these places at all costs. From gruesome murders to abandoned buildings to cults and even serial killers, the cities and towns on this list are unsettling to say the least. So if you're a tourist with an affinity for the supernatural, a ghost, or just interested in seeing how horrifying parts of America can be, these are the top 10 creepiest places in the United States. Number 10. Galveston, Texas. There is a reason Galveston is often called a cemetery with a beach attached. In 1885, the island was the largest and richest city in Texas, the second biggest immigration port in the country, and well on its way to becoming the next Manhattan. That is, until the Galveston hurricane of 1900, which was actually the worst natural disaster in US history. It decimated the town and destroyed the bridges to the mainland, leaving thousands stranded on the island, only to perish in the ensuing floods and storm surge. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died altogether, with many of their bodies being buried wherever they were found, resulting in the city, which was almost entirely rebuilt, being constructed upon thousands of corpses. Strangely enough, some of the island's historic mansions survived relatively unscathed. Their long, empty hallways now the site of many reports of ghostly figures and disembodied footsteps, voices, and music. Now, I've been to Galveston a few times, and even if you don't believe in the paranormal, many parts of the island just feel off. Perhaps due to the countless cemeteries and empty plots of land, large vacant Victorian buildings, and old decaying infrastructure. Number 9. Baltimore, Maryland. Upon arrival, it isn't surprising that the Ouija board was invented here, or why Edgar Allan Poe chose to call Baltimore home. Most of the city just has this strange feeling in the air, and it's not only due to its reputation as one of the most dangerous places in America. Countless tragic events have played out on Baltimore's historic streets over the past 300 years, and when you learn the horrific history of many of the sites that still stand today, such as Fort McHenry, where hundreds were killed during the War of 1812, and more were executed during the Civil War, suddenly all of the drugs, gangs, and crime seem like a walk in the park. Okay, that probably wasn't the best choice of words, because you should definitely avoid taking a walk in Leakin Park, where over 80 dead bodies have been found. And speaking of dead bodies, the Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, featuring the grave of Edgar Allan Poe, is a place shrouded in mystery. On Poe's birthday every year from the 1940s until 2009, a mysterious black-cloaked figure would appear at his grave and leave 3 roses. Their identity still unknown to this day. Medical students from the nearby University of Maryland, Baltimore also reportedly dug up and stole bodies from these catacombs to use for their experiments. But of the hundreds of creepy locations in the city, perhaps none are as unsettling as Fells Point, a neighborhood full of uncanny locations Poe once frequented, and where he was found unconscious in the gutters, wearing someone else's clothes shortly before his mysterious death. Number 8. Fall River, Massachusetts. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. If that sends shivers down your spine, then no, it's not just an eerie rhyme. It tells the tale of Lizzie Borden brutally murdering her parents in their Fall River family home in 1892. Without enough evidence to be proven guilty, Lizzie walked free and spent the rest of her days living in the very town where she had committed her treacherous crimes. But the sinister past of Fall River runs even deeper than this. From countless deaths during King Philip's War to the ghost of a Native American man named Abram who was forced to jump from a 40-foot rock in 1675, the surrounding forests are riddled with darkness. Even as recently as the 1980s, a satanic cult murdered multiple women here, and many hikers with no prior knowledge of the events have reported hearing the victims' names whispered in the woods. Number 7. San Francisco, California. Despite its modernization, the gloomy mist that shrouds one of California's oldest cities remains the same. What was once a lawless town of gold fever and devious robber barons is now a city of cryptocurrency and digital tycoons. But no matter how hard it tries, San Francisco cannot erase its troubling history of torture, cults, race riots, suicides, and even serial killers. Take Angel Island, once known as the Ellis Island of the West Coast. Nearly 250,000 immigrants were held here in horrific conditions for months before they could even step foot in San Francisco. Many died while waiting. Their poems, which are still inscribed in the walls of the barracks, serving as a tragic reminder of all the innocent lives lost. In contrast, it was only the wealthy who visited Sutro Baths, one of the world's largest indoor swimming pools in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The building mysteriously burned down in 1966, but the pool and nearby tunnel, which was the site of many human sacrifices, still remain, often engulfed in a sea of fog. But of all of San Francisco's creepy locations, from Stowe Lake to the Presidio to the back alleys of Chinatown, Alcatraz is likely the most dubious of them all. Some of the most notorious criminals were held here under appalling conditions, and at least 28 died during the nearly 30 years the prison operated, including 8 who were murdered by other inmates. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, it's impossible to avoid the chilling atmosphere if you visit, especially at night. Number 6. Chicago, Illinois. It was February 14th, 1929, and although Valentine's Day is usually reserved for lovers, Al Capone chose violence. 7 men in a rival gang were lined up and mowed down in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But that merciless shooting pales in comparison to the horrific events that occurred in the H.H. Holmes murder castle. Home to one of the country's first serial killers, the mansion included stairs that led to nowhere, oddly angled hallways, and windowless rooms designed to disorient and trap Holmes's victims, most of whom were women he lured from the 1893 World's Fair. He confessed to at least 27 murders, but historians estimate the real number to be over 200. And while thousands of creepy buildings and sites in the Windy City are plagued with dark histories, the most dreadful tragedies don't involve murder, but rather fire. We've all heard of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed a third of the city's structures, killed 300 residents, and left 100,000 homeless. But an even more deadly fire raged out in 1903 at the Iroquois Theater. Over 2,000 theatergoers were trapped inside, and many died jumping from the upper floors into the rear alleyway in an attempt to escape the blazes. 602 perished altogether, a third of whom were children. Today, many theatergoers and cast members have reported the faint sounds of children laughing and crying, and even feelings of being pushed in the upper rows. Number 5. Charleston, South Carolina. In the early 1700s, Charleston had a pirate problem, but not all were bad. Stede Bonnet, a wealthy landowner turned pirate, actually paid his crew a fair wage. But his progressive ways soon met their end in 1718, when he and 50 of his men were captured and executed in the White Point Garden, their bodies left hanging for days as a warning to other transgressors. And that was just the start of Charleston's long, dark history of death, torture, racism, and slavery. The old Charleston jail housed countless convicts, pirates, and Civil War prisoners during the 1800s, and was the site of nearly 14,000 executions, including Lavina Fisher, the first female serial killer, and Denmark Vesey, a free man and leader in the black community who was accused of organizing a slave revolt. But that jail would seem like a 5-star resort compared to the appalling conditions of the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon, a British prison built underneath a customs house in 1767. Disease was rampant, and some of the POWs, slaves, and pirates who were held here drowned in groundwater seepage or were burned alive. The historic city is also home to an abundance of creepy overgrown graveyards and reportedly haunted inns. And for the most daring, take a visit to Charleston's old slave mart, the only building still standing today which witnessed the atrocity of human beings being sold as goods. I've been once before, and it's impossible to not sense an overbearing darkness in the air. Number 4. St. Augustine, Florida. Today, St. Augustine is a bit of a tourist trap, but most of those tourists have no idea about its treacherous past. In 1837, Chief Osceola and 200 of his men were tricked into captivity at the Castillo de San Marcos during the Second Seminole War. He died after being moved to a prison in South Carolina, but his head was severed from his corpse and sent back to St. Augustine to be displayed in a drugstore. Countless other Native Americans were also imprisoned at the same fort, which still stands today, including over 500 Apaches in 1886. But the disrespect didn't end there. In the mid-1700s, the Spanish actually built an entire hospital on an indigenous burial ground and performed all sorts of experimental procedures. Thousands of bones were discovered when parts of the building burnt down in 1818, and many guilt-ridden doctors actually killed themselves after witnessing so much suffering and death from their patients. And I haven't even scratched the surface of the countless supposedly haunted locations that torment the oldest European US settlement, such as the Huguenot Cemetery, which was created by necessity after bodies piled in the streets following the yellow fever outbreak of 1821, or the famous old jail where conditions were notoriously inhumane, with hundreds of deaths from illness and accidental treatments. Number 3, Savannah, Georgia. Plagued by everything from hurricanes to fires to yellow fever and the selling of humans for profit, it's no surprise Savannah is often referred to as the most haunted city in America. I mean, it was literally built on the dead, with many buildings and roads sitting atop the graves of Native Americans and former slaves and colonists. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, the countless cemeteries, creepy old architecture, and lush overgrown vegetation with so much Spanish moss is sure to send a shiver down your spine, especially on an overcast day. But while nearly every corner of Georgia's oldest city is haunted by some dark past, the most sinister of all paranormal lurkings is Factor's Walk, where men once negotiated the price of cotton while the humans they enslaved to produce it were being transported through the tunnels beneath their feet. Though the tunnels are now mostly sealed, many visitors have reported ghostly specters and the sound of tormented groans through the cracks in the cold stone walls. Number 2, Salem, Massachusetts. Just about every New England town during the fall time feels incredibly spooky, but no place is quite as synonymous with the term as Salem. The year was 1692. Hundreds of residents were imprisoned during the Salem witch trials, with 14 women and 5 men ultimately executed under the accusation of witchcraft. One man in particular, Giles Corey, had rocks stacked on top of him until he was crushed to death. It's said that with his dying breath, Corey cursed the city and George Corwin, the high sheriff responsible for his and many others' torture and death. And most of Salem has reportedly been haunted ever since. Now, I grew up just down the road in Boston and visited Salem quite often throughout my youth. And yeah, Proctor's Ledge, the now confirmed site of the hangings and unceremonious dumping of their bodies, truly feels eerie and perturbing. So the question is the unsettling darkness that envelops Salem the fault of Giles' alleged curse? Or was that a fable invented by the town to explain why they were haunted by their own guilt?
Now before we get to number 1, make sure you leave a like and a subscribe, otherwise I will scare you every single night! But now get on with the video. I want to see where the most single ghosts are!
Number 1, New Orleans, Louisiana. Very little separates the living from the dead in New Orleans. Literally. Most of the city is below sea level, so tombs actually sit above ground in the 42 cemeteries within the city limits. Many locals even paint their porch roofs haint blue to repel the supposed spirits who wander the streets. And while nearly every inch of this incredibly unique city feels dreadfully haunted, the tale of the LaLaurie Mansion may just be the most grim. After a fire in 1834, rescuers found several bound slaves in the attic with signs of severe malnourishment, torture, and abuse. The owner, Madame Delphine LaLaurie, fled to France to avoid charges, but the home remains one of the most unsettling places in the country. If you're someone who doesn't think ghosts or the supernatural are real, a visit to New Orleans, and especially the French Quarter, might just change your mind.